All right, ready to dive into some serious metaphysics. You requested a deep dive into modal fictionalism. And let me tell you, this is one of those philosophical rabbit holes that can really make your head spin. Perfect for a philosophy enthusiast like yourself. But even if you're, well-versed in philosophy, modal fictionalism can be a bit of a mind bender.
It really is. What I find so intriguing about it is this. It tackles the very nature of possibility itself. We use the language of possibility all the time, right? Like, I could have gone to the beach today, or it's possible that it will rain tomorrow. But what does it actually mean for something to be possible?
Yeah, it seems like such a simple question on the surface. But once you start digging deeper, things get complicated real quick.
Yeah.
That's where possible worlds come into play.
Exactly. Possible worlds are these theoretical constructs that philosophers use to, analyze modal claims about what's possible, necessary, or impossible. Think of them as fully fleshed out ways things could have been.
Okay, so if I say, it's possible that I could have won the lottery last night, does that mean there's a possible world out there where I actually did win?
That's the basic idea, yeah. But now we run into a bit of a problem. Do we really want to commit to the existence of all these other worlds? It seems a bit extravagant, doesn't it? Infinite universes just to account for every possibility.
Yeah, that's a lot to swallow. So
Mhm.
that's where modal fictionalism comes in, right?
Exactly. Instead of taking possible worlds literally, like actual places that exist out there somewhere, modal fictionalism treats them as fictional constructs. It's like we're telling a story about these other worlds, but we don't actually believe they exist.
So it's like we get to use the idea of possible worlds as a tool without the metaphysical baggage.
Precisely. And this approach has, some real advantages. It lets us use this powerful machinery of possible worlds without all the metaphysical baggage that comes with actually believing in them.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal, but how does that actually work in practice? How can we say that something is true about possibility if it's based on something that's, well, fictional?
Right, that's the heart of the puzzle. And different modal fictionalists have slightly different answers, but one common thread is this. Statements about possible worlds are technically false because the worlds themselves don't exist, but they're true according to the fiction.
So it's kind of like saying, according to the Sherlock Holmes stories, there's a brilliant detective living at 221B Baker Street. That statement is technically fucks, but it's true within the fictional world of those stories.
Perfect analogy. And just like we can use those Sherlock Holmes stories to explore themes of justice, deduction, and Victorian England, modal fictionalists use their fictional worlds to explore, the logic of possibility and necessity.
I'm starting to get it, I think, but it still feels a bit slippery to me.
Yeah,
I mean, how do we even know what's true according to the fiction? Doesn't it just come down to, making stuff up?
I can see why you'd say that. It's a valid concern. Different modal fictionalists have different ways of specifying the content of their fictional worlds. Some draw inspiration from really detailed accounts of possible worlds given by, say, philosophers like David Lewis, even though Lewis himself was a realist about possible worlds.
So they're borrowing from a realist but using it for fictionalist purposes. That's interesting. Are there different ways to actually be a modal fictionalist, though?
Absolutely. One important distinction is between what we call strong and timid modal fictionalism. The strong version makes a bolder claim. It says that the fiction actually explains modal truths. The timid version is more cautious. It says the fiction just reflects those truths.
So for the strong modal fictionalist, the fiction is somehow like foundational to modality, whereas for the timid modal fictionalist, it's more of a descriptive tool.
Exactly. And this difference has real implications for how we understand the relationship between, the fiction and the modal truths that it's supposed to represent.
I can imagine the strong version runs into some pretty tricky questions. Like, if the fiction is supposed to explain modal truths, how can it be based on those very truths without being circular?
That's a major challenge for strong modal fictionalism. Critics argue that it either ends up being circular or it needs to posit some kind of brute, unexplained connection between the fiction and the modal truths it's trying to explain. It's a tough nut to crack.
What about the timid version, then? Does it face its own set of problems?
It does. Critics of the timid approach often accuse it of lacking explanatory power. Like, if the fiction is just mirroring what's already true about modality, what's the point of having the fiction in the first place?
Right. It's like saying, we can represent the laws of physics with this elaborate fictional story, but the story itself isn't adding anything new to our understanding of physics. It's just a different way of expressing what we already know.
Yeah, that's the gist of the critique. So you see, the strong version faces worries about circularity, while the timid version faces worries about explanatory power. It's a tough balancing act for sure.
It sounds like finding that sweet spot, that right level of dependence between the fiction and the modal truths, is one of the key challenges for modal fictionalists.
It really is. And to complicate things further, there's another dimension to this debate. Normative versus descriptive modal fictionalism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
Well, the normative version of modal fictionalism says that this is how we should think about possible worlds. It's like presenting a new framework for understanding modality, right? The descriptive version, on the other hand, claims that this is how we actually use possible worlds, even if we don't realize it.
So it's the difference between prescribing a new way of doing philosophy and describing an existing practice, sort of.
Exactly. And this distinction is important because it affects how we evaluate, the success of modal fictionalism. If it's a normative claim, then we need to ask whether it's a good way to do philosophy, whether it actually helps us understand modality better. If it's a descriptive claim, then we need to ask whether it accurately captures our existing practices, whether it reflects how we actually reason about possibility.
This is all incredibly fascinating. I'm starting to see how modal fictionalism, despite its initial simplicity, really opens up a whole Pandora's box of philosophical questions. But there's one thing I'm still a bit fuzzy on: the content of the fiction itself. If we're going to use this possible worlds fiction, what does it actually look like?
That's where things get really interesting, and it's definitely a point of contention among modal fictionalists. Some are content to leave the specifics rather vague, focusing more on, the general framework.
So they're just saying there's a fictional world where X is true, but they don't go into detail about what that world is like.
Exactly. They might say there's a possible world where pigs can fly, but they don't tell us anything about the aerodynamics of porcine flight or what that world's bacon industry looks like.
Right. I can see how that might frustrate some philosophers who want a more fleshed out picture. Are there any modal fictionalists who give a more, detailed account of their fictional worlds?
Oh, absolutely. One notable example is D.M. Armstrong, who proposed what he called a two-step fiction. It starts with a great fiction, which is essentially the story that there are all these possible worlds out there.
So the great fiction kind of sets the stage, so to speak.
Exactly. Then, within this great fiction, there are all these little fictions, each of which provides a complete description of a particular possible world.
So it's like a story within a story. The great fiction frames the whole thing, and the little fictions flesh out all the details of each possible world. That's pretty clever. But are these little fictions just abstract descriptions, or are they more like concrete universes?
That's a great question, and it gets to a key point about Armstrong's view. He believed that possible worlds should be understood as concrete universes, not just abstract sets of propositions.
So they're like fully fleshed out realities, much like our own universe, but with different features.
Precisely. And Armstrong was careful to distinguish between the descriptions of these worlds, which are part of the little fictions, and the worlds themselves, which he saw as existing within the great fiction.
I see. So he's drawing a clear line between the fictional representations and the fictional entities those representations are about.
Mm.
Were there any other approaches to, fleshing out the content of the fiction?
Yes. Another interesting proposal came from Gideon Rosen. Instead of creating his own fictional world from scratch, he took a rather ingenious approach. He borrowed the detailed account of possible worlds developed by, David Lewis.
Wait, wasn't Lewis a realist about possible worlds? Didn't he think they actually exist?
He did, but that's what makes Rosen's move so clever. He took Lewis's detailed framework, which Lewis presented as literally true, and recast it as a fictional construct.
Oh, so he's essentially co-opting a realist's blueprint
Yeah.
and repurposing it for fictionalist aims. That's pretty audacious.
It is, and it raises all sorts of interesting questions about the relationship between, fictional and non-fictional accounts of possible worlds.
This is all so fascinating. But I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface. Are there other ways of specifying the content of this modal fiction?
Oh, there are. Some modal fictionalists, for example, suggest that we should build the fiction to mirror the principles we use in, say, modal thought experiments. After all, that's one of the primary ways we explore modality in the first place.
So the modal fiction should kind of reflect our actual practices of reasoning about possibilities.
Precisely. But even with this constraint, there's still the question of whether we can, pin down a single correct modal fiction or whether there might be multiple equally good candidates. And that leads to even deeper questions about the objectivity of modal truth.
It seems like every answer just leads to more questions. I'm already starting to feel my head spin a little.
Well, that's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It takes these seemingly simple concepts like possibility and it reveals all these hidden depths and complexities. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Well, maybe we should take a pause here and let our listeners digest all this before we dive into, the technical challenges that modal fictionalism faces.
That sounds like a good plan. We've laid the groundwork, and now we're ready to grapple with some of the really thorny issues. So, are you ready to tackle some of the objections to modal fictionalism? As you might imagine, a view this radical is going to attract some pretty serious philosophical scrutiny.
Oh, I'm ready. Bring it on. It wouldn't be a deep dive without exploring the potential pitfalls. I have a feeling these challenges are going to be pretty mind-bending.
Oh, they are. But they're also incredibly insightful. They really make you think carefully about the very foundations of, modality and the role of fiction in philosophical inquiry. One of the most famous objections to modal fictionalism is known as the Brock-Rosen objection, named after the philosophers who first formulated it.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the gist of this objection?
It's a bit technical, but I think we can unpack it in a way that'll make sense. Remember how modal fictionalism tries to avoid saying that possible worlds actually exist?
Yeah, that's kind of the whole point, right? Possible worlds are just part of this fictional story, not actually part reality.
Exactly. But the Brock-Rosen objection tries to show that Rosen's version of modal fictionalism, the one that borrows Lewis's framework, actually ends up implying the existence of possible worlds.
Wait, hold on. How does that happen?
Uh-huh.
How can a view that's supposed to be anti-realist about possible worlds end up being realist? That seems like a pretty big problem.
It is a huge problem, and the argument hinges on a clever bit of reasoning about the modal status of claims about possible worlds themselves. Remember those biconditionals we discussed earlier, the ones that connect modal truths to what's true in all possible worlds, according to the fiction.
You mean the ones that say something like, it's necessary that P, if and only if P is true in all possible worlds, according to the fiction?
That's the one, yeah. Now, in Rosen's adopted framework, which he took from David Lewis, possible worlds are understood as concrete, coexisting universes. And this claim, that there are many possible worlds, is itself supposed to be true in each of those worlds.
So according to the fiction, it's true in all possible worlds that there are many possible worlds. Kind of a tongue twister.
Yeah, a bit of a mouthful. But now, if we apply that biconditional, we get the following. If it's true in all possible worlds, according to the fiction, that there are many possible worlds, then it must be necessarily true that there are many possible worlds.
Oh, I think I'm starting to see the problem here. If it's necessarily true that there are many possible worlds, then they have to actually exist. That's just what it means for something to be necessarily true, right? Can't be false, so it has to be true in the actual world as well.
Exactly. And that's the crux of the Brock-Rosen objection. It seems like Rosen's modal fictionalism, despite its best efforts, can't avoid affirming the very thing it's trying to deny, the literal existence of many possible worlds.
So is this a fatal blow to modal fictionalism then? Does this objection just completely dismantle the whole project?
Not quite. Philosophers are a resourceful bunch, as you know, and they've come up with several responses to this challenge. Some have proposed modifying those fictionalist biconditionals to create a version of modal fictionalism that's immune to this particular objection.
So like tweaking the rules of the game to block this particular line of attack.
Exactly. But others have argued that even with these modifications, the problem might still persist in a more subtle form. It's a really intricate debate, lots of back and forth.
I bet. Are there any other responses to the Brock-Rosen objection that, don't involve revising the biconditionals?
Yes, actually. Maybe the most influential response came from the philosopher Harold Noonan. He argued that the Brock-Rosen objection, while very clever, actually relies on a misunderstanding of how we translate modal claims into, the language of possible worlds.
So a translation error is leading to this apparent contradiction.
You could say that, yes. Noonan pointed out that if we stick really closely to the specific translation procedures that David Lewis himself laid out, we can't actually derive that problematic claim, the one that says it's necessarily true that there are many possible worlds. The objection it just doesn't go through.
Okay, phew. It sounds like modal fictionalism might still have a fighting chance. But I have a feeling there are other challenges waiting in the wings.
Oh, you're absolutely right about that. Modal fictionalism has been poked and prodded from all sides, but that's part of what makes it such a rich and thought-provoking topic. Another significant challenge comes from Bob Hale, and it's known as Hale's dilemma.
Okay, bring on the dilemma. What does Hale's challenge focus on?
This one goes right to the heart of the modal status of the fiction itself. Remember, modal fictionalism says that possible worlds are just part of a story, but what kind of story is it? Is it a story that could have been true, or is it a story that's necessarily false?
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. If the fiction is necessarily false, that means it couldn't have been true under any circumstances. But if it's contingently false, well, that means it's possible that it could have been true.
Exactly. And Hale argues that either option leads to trouble for the modal fictionalist. Let's start with the first horn of the dilemma. What if the fiction is necessarily false?
Well, if the fiction is necessarily false, then it seems like that would undermine its ability to tell us anything meaningful about possibility. If it couldn't have been true under any circumstances, then how can it possibly ground truths about what could have been?
That's one way to put it. Another way to think about it is this. Remember how we gloss what's true according to the fiction, using those conditional statements like, if the Sherlock Holmes stories were true, then there would be a brilliant detective living at 221B Baker Street.
Yeah, it's like a way of talking about what would be the case if the fiction were true, even though we know it's not.
Precisely. But there's a kind of a quirk in logic. If the antecedent of a conditional statement, the if part, is necessarily false, then the whole conditional just becomes what we call vacuously true, regardless of what the consequent, the then part, actually says.
Hold on. So if the fiction of possible worlds is necessarily false, then any statement of the form, according to the fiction, P, just becomes automatically true no matter what P is.
That's the worry, yeah. It would make the fiction completely useless. We could say, according to the fiction, the moon is made of cheese, and that would count as true.
Okay, so the fiction can't be necessarily false if it's going to actually do any work for the modal fictionalist.
Yeah.
So what about the other horn of the dilemma then? What if the fiction is contingently false? What's the problem there?
Well, if the fiction is contingently false, that means it's possible that it could have been true. But Hale argues that the modal fictionalist can't actually capture this possibility using their own framework. Let's think about the claim. It's possible that the fiction of possible worlds is true. How would a modal fictionalist translate that using their own, biconditionals?
It seems like they'd have to say something like, according to the fiction, there's a possible world where the fiction is true.
Exactly. But Hale points out that this statement, when translated into the language of possible worlds, ends up being a conditional that's true regardless of whether the fiction itself is, true or not. It doesn't really capture that genuine possibility that the fiction could have been actually true.
Oh, I see, I see. So it's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If the fiction is necessarily false, then it becomes, I guess, trivial and useless. But if it's contingently false, they can't properly express that contingency using their own tools.
Precisely. Hale's dilemma poses a very serious challenge to modal fictionalism. It forces us to think really carefully about the modal status of the fiction itself and how it relates to those modal truths it's supposed to, either explain or represent.
So how do modal fictionalists respond to this challenge? Is there any way out of this dilemma?
There are a few potential responses. One approach is to challenge Hale's understanding of how we actually translate modal claims into the language of possible worlds. Others have suggested that maybe we need to revisit those, glosses on, according to the fiction, exploring different ways of understanding what it means for something to be true within the fiction.
So back to the drawing board, trying to refine the machinery of modal fictionalism to make it more robust and, able to stand up to these objections.
That's right. And Rosen himself offered a pretty intriguing response. He suggested that instead of viewing the fiction as either, true or false, we should think of it as lacking a truth value altogether.
So it's not true, it's not false, it's just kind of this conceptual tool that's operating outside the realm of truth and falsity.
Precisely. This move sidesteps Hale's dilemma quite neatly, which, as you'll recall, really focuses on the truth value of the fiction.
Clever. But even if modal fictionalism can overcome all of these, technical challenges, I have a feeling there are other, maybe more conceptual concerns lurking out there.
Oh, you're right. Modal fictionalism has been subjected to, just a whole battery of objections. And that's really a testament to the depth and richness of of this philosophical view, right? It raises questions that really cut to the very core of how we understand possibility, necessity, and, the role of fiction in philosophical inquiry. It's a really rich area.
Well, on that note, I think we've given our listener a lot to chew on for now. Let's pick up the discussion in the next part of our deep dive. All right, so let's pick back up with our deep dives into modal fictionalism. We've covered a lot of ground already, but, there's still plenty more to explore. I think you were about to talk about some other, conceptual challenges for modal fictionalism.
Yeah, exactly. Even if we sort of set aside those, really technical objections like we were talking about, there's still a bunch of other concerns that we need to think about. Like, okay, even if we accept that we can treat possible worlds as fictional, there's still this question: which fiction should we use? I mean, we could tell all sorts of stories about possible worlds. So, like, what makes one better than another? How do we even choose?
That's a really good point. It can't just be a matter of, personal taste or just making stuff up,
Yeah.
right? There has to be some reason, some criteria for picking one fiction over another.
Absolutely. And this gets to a concern that's often called the incompleteness problem. Fictions are, well, they're often incomplete by their very nature. There are details that just, they just don't specify.
Right, like in those Sherlock Holmes stories, yeah.
Yeah.
We know he lives at 221B Baker Street, but the stories don't, tell us everything about his daily life, what kind of tea he drinks or what his, bookshelves look like exactly. That's all left up to us to imagine.
Exactly. And that's totally fine for, a regular work of fiction. But it's potentially a problem for a modal fiction that's, supposedly grounding all modal truth. I mean, there are probably an infinite number of those truths, an infinite number of things that are possible or necessary, right? So how could any one fiction possibly capture all those details and be like trying to write a novel that includes literally every possible event that could ever happen?
Yeah, I see what you mean. It seems kind of impossible for any one fiction to be that
Yeah.
comprehensive.
Right. And this worry about incompleteness, it can take, different forms. So, for example, Gideon Rosen, he worried about cases where the fiction is just silent on a particular issue, like not because the fictionalist doesn't know the answer, but because the fiction itself just doesn't, it just doesn't say one way or the other.
So it's not that the fictionalist is ignorant. It's more like the fiction itself just doesn't contain the answer. There's no truth within the fiction to be found, right?
Exactly. And Rosen was concerned that this could lead to some pretty strange consequences for, for how we understand modal claims. Like if the fiction doesn't tell us anything about whether, say, possible worlds are finite or infinite in size, well, does that mean there just is no fact of the matter about the size of possible worlds?
That does seem like a problem, yeah. If the fiction is supposed to give us this complete picture of modality, but it turns out it just doesn't address certain key questions.
Yeah, exactly. And this concern about incompleteness, it was also raised by Daniel Nolan, who argued that even if we grant the fictionalists some kind of general principles about how possible worlds work, those principles might not actually be enough to implicitly capture all the specific details that are needed to account for every single modal truth.
Right, because even if a principle holds true in all possible worlds, it still leaves a lot of room for specific details.
Right, right, exactly. Like imagine a principle that says, in all possible worlds, the laws of logic hold. Okay, pretty basic, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't tell us anything about the specific content of those laws in any particular world.
Ah, I see. So the general principle doesn't really constrain the specifics enough to really pin things down.
Exactly. And, to make things even more complicated, this very idea of a general principle implying all the necessary details, well, that's itself a modal notion.
Oh, right. So the modal fictionalist, especially the strong kind, who wants to, you know, reduce modality to something non-modal, they run into a bit of a snag because now they're relying on modality to explain how their fiction can cover all those modal truths.
Exactly. That was the heart of Nolan's worry. It's like the strong modal fictionalist has this really tough choice. Either they have to accept a fiction that's, radically incomplete, one that doesn't really capture all modal truths, or they have to find some way to specify all those implicit details without using modal concepts. And that's, well, it's a tall order.
Neither option sounds that great, to be honest. It's kind of a lose-lose situation.
It is. And it all leads back to that really big question we started with. If we're going to use a modal fiction, which one do we use? How do we pick the right story out of all those possible stories?
Right. Because it can't be arbitrary, right? There has to be something that makes one fiction more suitable than another.
Exactly. And, a lot of modal fictionalists are They're a bit vague on this point. They don't really give us these like detailed criteria for selecting the right fiction. But there are, some potential constraints that we can, think about that we can appeal to.
Okay, like what? What kind of constraints were we talking about?
Well, one constraint is that the fiction should, it should align with our pre-theoretical modal judgments. Basically, the stuff we just intuitively believe about what's possible and necessary.
So it can't just say like that it's possible for squares to be circles or for time to run backwards. It has to kind of respect those, our basic intuitions about modality.
Right, exactly. Another constraint is that the fiction should incorporate, truths about the actual world. It can't just be this completely disconnected story. It has to be, grounded in the reality we actually live in.
Makes sense. I mean, if we're trying to understand our modal situation, what's possible or necessary for us, then the fiction has to start from the facts about our world.
Right, exactly. And Rosen, he suggested another interesting constraint, which is that the fiction, it should mirror those principles that we use in, say, modal thought experiments. After all, that's one of the primary ways that we actually explore modality in the first place.
So the fiction should kind of reflect our actual practices, the ways we already reason about possibilities.
That's the thought. But, even with all these constraints, there's still a potential problem, which is that there might be multiple fictions that fit the bill, multiple stories about possible worlds that all satisfy those requirements equally well.
So then how do we choose between them? Does it even matter which one we pick?
Now, that is a great question, and it really gets to the heart of, some deep philosophical issues about the nature of modality and what role these fictions play in our understanding of it. If those constraints aren't enough to pick out one single correct modal fiction, then, well, what does that mean for the objectivity of modal truth? Can we even be modal fictionalists if we don't, if we don't pick one definitive fiction?
Those are some big questions. And it seems like, I mean, we've only just scratched the surface of this whole philosophical puzzle that modal fictionalism presents. It's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is, but that's the beauty of, of exploring these ideas. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about asking those tough questions, about, really challenging our assumptions.
Yeah.
And hopefully, along the way, we get a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it.
Well said. And I think we've definitely given our listeners out there, a lot to think about, a lot to mull over after this deep dive. So thanks for taking this journey with us, and a huge thank you to you for being such a fantastic guide. I've learned a lot today.
The pleasure was all mine. It's been great exploring this with you. And to all our listeners out there, keep on exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deep. There's a whole world of philosophy out there just waiting to be discovered.